I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 6. Occupation. Washington, D.C. White House. So what's the plan with the UN and Canada? Asked National Security Advisor Robert Gray. General Tibbets, who was joining them via video teleconference from the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, responded, "Right now, we're moving the 10th Mountain Division, the 38th Infantry Division, and the 28th Infantry Division into the country to establish an occupation force for the time being. That'll essentially give us roughly 34,000 soldiers to administer the occupation and continue to handle the insurgency and military forces that have not surrendered. 2 of the divisions are National Guard divisions, but they've performed quite well, so I'm confident they'll be able to handle the job. I've also tasked 5th Special Forces Group and SEAL Team 1 and 2 to support them as well. This entire force is responsible for the occupation of Canada and the continued hunting down of the remaining CDF forces in our northern states that tried to defect. I've largely given the task of dealing with the CDF to Special Forces. They have the intelligence, aerial support, and capability to move around the area rapidly. But before I conclude, I'd also like to recommend that we set up a plan to bring in some private military contractors. My soldiers can't be everywhere, and frankly, I'd rather leave the security work to the PMCs while we shift my soldiers down to face the Chinese." The president thought about that for a moment. He wasn't particularly fond of using contractors like that, but he also understood the need to get more of their divisions shifted south to deal with the Chinese. Finally, Sachs nodded in agreement. "Okay, General, you may start incorporating some security contractors, but I want them kept on a tight leash and given proper oversight. Now, what's going on out west in Washington State, Oregon, and the western part of Canada?" "The divisions and special forces I mentioned earlier will also cover the western Canadian provinces as well," Tibbets responded. "This is why I proposed bringing in some security contractors. Right now, we've divided Canada up into Occupation Zone East and Occupation Zone West, or as we're now calling them, OZE or OZW. Once we get the security situation sorted with the right PMCs, I'll shift 2 of the 3 divisions out of Canada South to join our forces fighting the Chinese. We'll still leave the same number of special forces up there, but it'll free up more than 20,000 soldiers to fight the PLA." Patty Hogan from DHS added, "I'd also like to say that at this point, we've now grown the Federal Protective Service to a little over 108,000 personnel. We've moved around 30,000 of them to the Upper East Coast and another 15,000 to Illinois and Wisconsin. I believe the FPS can now help out with more of the occupation duties, if you'd like to incorporate them into your planning, General Tibbets." "Yes, what about that, General?" asked NSA Gray. "We've spent 4 full months training this force to essentially handle the law enforcement functions where the local and state governments haven't been able to act independently. Can we perhaps use them to help with the occupation in Canada, to help free up more of your men?" General Tibbets shook his head and frowned. "No, I don't think it would be wise to bring them into Canada," he answered emphatically. "Director Hogan's group is a U.S. law enforcement entity. We should focus on using them in the liberated zones to continue to help put down the CDF groups wherever we find them. I'd feel much more comfortable with the PMCs working with our soldiers on foreign soil." The president leaned forward in his chair. "That makes good sense to me, General," he responded. "We'll stick with the PMCs in Canada and have Patty's group stay focused in the U.S. Now let's move on to the situation with China and the Pacific. What are we doing to regain control of the Pacific and cut off their supply lines? The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Chester Smith, took his cue. Now that the conflict in Canada and the Atlantic is largely over with, we're shifting a large percentage of our naval forces from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Even now, our Atlantic subs are transiting under the northern polar caps and will enter the Pacific near Alaska. Then they'll travel closer to Chinese waters and interdict some of their convoys as they head to the U.S. I'm also ordering several additional submarines to join our flotilla around Hawaii. The island's still a mess since the EMP and cruise missile attack. I want to make sure the Chinese don't get the idea that they can just waltz in there and try and take it from us. What about our 2 carriers in the Atlantic? How do you plan on using them? Asked the President. I'm going to have them take up positions in the Gulf, Admiral Smith explained. They'll be able to provide support to our ground units fighting in Texas. When will we be ready to recapture Panama and the Canal? Asked Sachs, eager to get that passageway reopened to the U.S. The Admiral grimaced at the question. I'm afraid not for some time, Mr. President. We're in the process of moving the 29th Infantry Division to join our Marine Force on Cuba so they can finish liberating the island. Next, they'll move to liberate the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. That force will then continue to conduct a series of island-hopping campaigns to take back the rest of the Caribbean. Our plan right now is to hold off on liberating Panama until we're ready to launch Operation Odin. General Marcus held a hand up. We can talk more about Odin later if you want, Mr. President, but not everyone in this room has been cleared to know about that yet. The President quickly nodded. Thank you, General. He took a swig of coffee, then continued. Someone please tell me what is going on in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. General Tibbets spoke up. We're holding the enemy in Texas, but just barely. I'll be frank. If it wasn't for thousands of Texas militia members carrying out all sorts of hit-and-run attacks on the PLA, I think the Chinese might have captured the bulk of the state. As it is, the Chinese have had to keep a substantial number of troops stationed in a lot of cities and surrounding areas to try and tamp down the insurgent attacks. It's a bloody mess all across Texas right now. As to New Mexico, we just don't have enough forces to keep them from capturing more of the state. We're looking to try and hold them along the Colorado border. Arizona is pretty much the same. The nuclear attack on Yuma wiped out an armor brigade that would have held the enemy at bay. That hit really hurt us. The PLA has pushed our remaining forces to just south of Phoenix. Again, if it wasn't for the local militia units joining in, I think we would have lost the state a few weeks ago. As it stands, we're doing our best to evacuate our assets out of Luke Air Force Base and establish a new line of defense near Fort Mojave. This will allow us to block them from breaking out into Nevada and threatening our assets in that area. The President blew some air out of his lips forcefully, as if trying to create a smoke ring. Are we going to be able to keep the Chinese contained in the southern states? I'm concerned that if they break out, there might not be anything to stop them for hundreds of miles. We're doing our best, Mr. President, General Marcus insisted. That's all the more reason we need as much of the security work in Canada handed off to some competent PMCs so we can shift at least 2 of those divisions down to the Arizona and New Mexico fronts. How many soldiers and Marines are we graduating from training each week? Sachs inquired. General Marcus took the question. The Marines are graduating 2,000 new Marines a week. It'd be more, but they've lost all of their training facilities on the West Coast, so they're only able to rely on the East Coast facilities for training. The Army, on the other hand, is cranking out 8,000 soldiers a week. That number will double in 4 weeks, and it'll double again 8 weeks after that. By the end of the summer, we'll be graduating 32,000 soldiers a week. That'll be our max we can effectively train, pending we don't lose Fort Sill in Oklahoma, or Fort Polk in Louisiana," NSA Gray interrupted to add. The president sat there for a moment, digesting what everyone had just said. He wanted to make sure he had all the angles covered. Finally, he requested, "Okay, before I clear the room out so we can talk further about Operation Odin, what have we heard from the UN and Britain?" Secretary Haley Cagle jumped in. "I've spoken with the President of the UN General Assembly. They have disbanded the UN peacekeeping force and ordered all units currently in North America to cooperate with us and fully surrender. They are also stopping any material or advisory support to the CDF militias per the terms of surrender. The General Assembly leader also asked that we try to work out some sort of end to the war with the member states that participated in the UN peacekeeping operation. They want to put this ugly disaster behind them and allow everyone to return to normal." Sachs shook his head angrily. "I'll bet they do want to put an end to their ugly disaster. The problem is, we're still stuck having to deal with the death, destruction, and invasion by the Chinese that have happened as a result of their actions. I'll be damned if we're going to let them get off the hook that easily. I want you to work out some sort of reparations they'll have to fork over to help us recover from this foolish endeavor." The president paused for a second before adding, "I really wish Johann Baer hadn't taken his life. I would have loved to have tried him here in the U.S. What about the other co-conspirators Mr. Lammy told us about? Have we made any progress on their extraditions?" Secretary Cagle explained, "I know the Attorney General isn't here, but I will do my best to handle that question." She replied as she opened her binder. "The Norwegians and Germans are thus far unwilling to hand over their people who are involved in this conspiracy. Their argument is that we still have the death penalty, and they know there is a good likelihood that if their citizens are convicted in a court of law for their actions, they'd be put to death." Sachs slammed his hand down hard on the table, startling everyone present. "How many people have they killed because of this plan they hatched to steal our election? Our country was viciously attacked and then invaded. Hell, it was German and Russian special forces that nearly killed me on the first day of the war. No! You tell them they have 48 hours to hand them over to us, or we'll resume attacking their nations." Secretary Cagle nodded sheepishly. "I'll convey the message," she muttered, clearly a bit unhappy about the task she'd just been assigned. Then she straightened herself up in her chair. "If I may, I do have good news on some other fronts," she offered. "The Italians, Spanish, French, Russians, and the Netherlands have agreed to our terms of surrender. They ask that we not launch any attacks against their countries." NSA Gray's left eyebrow rose in surprise. "They agreed to the punitive financial terms we gave them as well?" he asked. The U.S. had requested that each of the member states that had participated in this military action compensate the families of the civilians who had been killed during the war with $1 million per family member killed. The U.S. also billed the group of nations collectively for $1 trillion in damages. While that amount wouldn't cover the damage that had been caused, it would go a long way toward helping to rebuild what had been destroyed. And President Sachs had made it abundantly clear that if the offending countries didn't pony up the money, the U.S. would begin systematically attacking their infrastructure. Secretary Cagle lifted her chin as she proudly reported, "They are working out the details, but I think an agreement is going to be achieved. Obviously, some of the richer nations, in particular Norway, France, and Germany, are going to pay the bulk of this fine we're levying, but I don't think they have a choice." "Okay. What about our allies?" asked the president. "Are any of them going to join our cause and help us out?" He desperately wanted the former NATO members to step up and come to their defense. Yes, Poland and Romania have agreed to send ground and air forces to the U.S. To my surprise, the British are also going to come to our aid. They're still facing some domestic blowback from the Labour Party, whose members convinced Great Britain to join the UN force at the outset of the war. But now that they knew it was a farce, they're coming to our aid." Sachs let out an audible sigh of relief. "I'll call the PM later to personally thank him for his support. We need to get their forces moved to the US ASAP. The Chinese are tearing us up out west." The president paused for a moment. "Okay, people. I think this has gotten us up to speed for the moment. I'm going to ask that we clear the room so I can talk with Secretary Howell, Admiral Smith, General Marcus, and NSA Gray. We'll resume our war updates in 2 days during our next NSC meeting." With only the 5 of them left in the Situation Room, NSA Gray asked, "Can you bring us up to speed on Operation Odin? Where does it stand, and when will it be ready?" The president leaned forward in his chair, his crossed arms resting on the table, as he waited for the status update of this extremely secretive program. It had been sucking an immense amount of resources out of other critical projects, and he wasn't convinced it was worth it yet. Admiral Smith sighed. "It's been a rough go of it. We've been hindered at nearly every possible turn in getting the 2 ships ready for operations. At this point, even with 24-hour shifts working 7 days a week, I think we may be delayed by as much as 3 or 4 months from starting the ship's sea trials, let alone sending them into combat." Sachs shook his head in frustration. "That's not acceptable, Admiral. What's been the hold-up? Do I need to get personally involved in unscrewing this situation?" Clearly frustrated, the Admiral explained. "With all the damage sustained by our naval ships in the Pacific and Atlantic, we've lost more than half of our work crews to get those other ships repaired and turned back around. We've also had to divert nearly all of our nuclear technicians and reactor fuel to getting our 2 carriers in their maintenance cycle, rushed out of their repairs and ready for combat. The Nimitz also sustained a lot more damage to the internal workings of the ship than we had first thought when we seized control of her again. We're just spread too thin without enough resources to make it all happen, sir." "How do we increase your workforce so you can meet the increased demand?" asked NSA Gray, a look of concern on his face. Admiral Smith huffed some air through his teeth. "I could use an executive order waiving some of the security requirements. We're bogged down on hiring new people. Specifically, we need to hire 12,000 electricians, 9,000 plumbers, 15,000 welders, and some 6,000 HVAC personnel. I also need another 18,000 computer programmers to help us sort through the software codes, along with roughly 300 nuclear technicians to get the reactors up and running. We're currently offering twice what they can make on the outside, plus unlimited overtime. These positions are essentially paying between $160,000 to as much as $450,000 a year with overtime. We've been inundated with more than 200,000 applications, but the problem is getting them security clearances to work on the project." "Okay, so how can I fix that problem for you?" the president asked, eager to get the project back on track by any and all means necessary. "If you can waive the rule that says they have to have a finalized clearance in order to start work, this would allow me to hire everyone we need next week. We can give them an interim top-secret clearance so they can start while their clearance is adjudicated. Until it's finalized, I'll have them work on our damaged destroyers, cruisers, and carriers, and shift our currently cleared workforce to Operation Odin. That would help me out immensely and still keep that project under wraps." The president turned to look at Secretary Howell. "Have the DoD draft up whatever I need to sign to make this happen. We need this enacted tomorrow, the day after by the latest. It's imperative that we get this project back on schedule." Howell nodded his head and scribbled some notes down on his paper. "Are these new weapons systems still going to work?" Gray asked skeptically. Admiral Smith nodded. "Yes. We've been testing them at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds and the Nevada Test Range for the past 2 years since we initiated the program. We've finally got the direct energy weapons working the way they're supposed to, and the railgun technology has been proven to be effective now for more than a decade. NSA Gray crossed his arms. So those media reports about the various weapon systems not working properly, or still being years away, are selective leaks? He asked. Exactly. Now that we've solved the problem of safely constructing micronuclear reactors, we've finally got a power generation source that can make these weapons a reality. We're going to use one of the reactors to power the day-to-day ship functions, while the other 3 reactors are going to be used solely to power and operate the weapons platforms. This was the last missing link in solving our power consumption problem for a weapons platform on a ship like this. The president snickered. Oh, how Congress is going to crow when they find out what we've done to the hulls of the 2 new Ford-class carriers. I don't think they'll give us much trouble once they find out how effective these weapons are going to be, replied NSA Gray. We just have to make sure we don't lose the entire West Coast and Hawaii to the Chinese before they're able to make a difference. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. General Mitchell International Airport. Captain Reagan found Colonel Beasley standing with his hands on his hips, looking at the long line of heavy equipment transporters that were loading the brigade's tanks up for the long trip down to Colorado Springs. Sensing someone had walked up near him, Colonel Beasley turned to find Captain Reagan. Beasley smiled and pointed to 3 C-17 Globemasters down near the Air National Guard side of the base. You see those planes? He asked. I do. Is that our ride to Colorado? Reagan asked, hoping they weren't going to have to drive down with their tanks. The crews were exhausted from months of fighting. They needed some time to recover. Yes, Colonel Beasley confirmed. The Stryker vehicles and other non-tracked vehicles will provide security. Not that we need it. Seems like the entire UN force has collapsed at this point. But anyway, all the tank crews and the non-essential folks that don't need to drive down with the JLTVs and Strykers will fly down with us. When we land in Colorado, I'm giving everyone 2 weeks R&R. You all have earned it, and I know many of you would like to see your families. We've been deployed for nearly 6 months now. The men need a break. I was told by the division CO that our brigade will receive new replacements and equipment during that 2-week hiatus. He wants us fresh and ready to go back into battle when we return from R&R. Reagan smiled at the thought of being able to go back home for a couple of weeks. That's the best news I've heard all day, sir, he replied. When do we load up, and how soon after we land do we start our R&R? Once we land at Colorado Springs International Airport, we'll drive over to Fort Carson. They've set up some temporary lodging facilities for all the units transiting to the base. From what I've been told, there are a handful of nearby hotels that are also being used for the officers and senior NCOs to help ease the overcrowding. The next day, Major General Walker is going to hold an award ceremony for our brigade at Pershing Field. So that we're not all standing around baking in the sun, he's going to hold several of them throughout the day. Each one will be broken down by battalions. Reagan raised an eyebrow at the thought of a day-long dog and pony show right before 2 weeks of R&R. Seeing his reaction, Colonel Beasley smirked. Don't worry, Captain. I know what you're thinking, and this won't be a whole-day affair. He's only sticking around to award Silver Stars and above. The battalion commanders will finish awarding the rest of the medals. As soon as they are concluded, everyone's being cut loose to start their R&R. Each soldier will be given a round-trip ticket to wherever their home of record is to go see their families. It's going to be imperative that you company COs make sure your people know when they have to return by. We won't have a lot of time after everyone gets back to get our units ready to deploy. They're gearing up for a major offensive to try and block the Chinese from breaking out of New Mexico. It's imperative that we keep them bottled up in the Southwest. If they break out into the heartland of the country, they could tear us apart." Reagan nodded. That was a major concern among a lot of his own soldiers. The Chinese had been bulldozing through the Americans. At some point, they needed to stop them. Returning his thoughts to the award ceremony, Captain Reagan cleared his throat. "If I can, sir, I put a lot of guys in for Purple Hearts and Bronze Stars with Lieutenant Colonel Short." Colonel Beasley interrupted him. "You also recommended 6 Silver Stars and 2 guys for the Distinguished Service Cross." Reagan nodded. "I did. I thought they more than earned them." The colonel paused for a second before he turned to look at Reagan. "I think so too, Captain. Based on my recommendation to the general, they are all receiving the awards you put them in for. Your battalion commander has a lot of promotions he's handing out during the award ceremony as well." Captain Reagan smiled with satisfaction. "Now, as for you, Captain, your battalion commander put you in for a Silver Star. I wanted to be the one to tell you that I approved that award, but I also put you in for the Distinguished Service Cross as well. You fought bravely, and more importantly, you saved a lot of lives when we broke out of southern Illinois." He put his hand on Reagan's shoulder. "I'm also going to be promoting you to Major. I hate to take you away from your command, but I need your smarts with me for this coming battle. This next fight against the Chinese is going to be a lot tougher than our fight against those UN losers. I'm going to have you take over the Brigade S3 shop for the time being." "Wow. Thank you for the decorations and promotion, but what happened to Lieutenant Colonel Rogers, the current S3? Is he okay?" Beasley lowered his head briefly before he responded. "Rogers needed to be transferred to a non-combat job for a little while. We found out 2 days ago that his family had been killed in a freak car accident. He lost his wife and 3 sons. He's in no situation to continue fighting with us, so he'll be sent back to the brigade armory and given light duty for a month or so to get his affairs in order. We'll reassess if he'll be able to rejoin the unit or if we're going to have to keep him back at the armory permanently." Reagan let out a low whistle. "Oh, man. That's terrible news, sir. I can't even imagine what he must be going through right now. Did he already fly home?" "Yeah. He left yesterday. That's why you didn't see him today at the commander's call. Look, I need to get going, Captain. Make sure your men know what's coming down, and make sure they know they only have 2 weeks at home. They must report back to the unit when the time comes." With that, Colonel Beasley walked away to go talk with one of his battalion commanders. Chapter 7. On the Run. New York, Lake Placid. President Marshall Tate sat in the theater room of the massive home, where he'd been hiding out for most of the last month. His beautiful bride and some of his closest advisors, the ones that hadn't jumped ship, were all there too, and they seemed to be thoroughly enjoying the film that was playing. However, Tate couldn't help but mull over the current situation. What do I do now? How did it all come down to this? Tate glanced behind him. 2 of his bodyguards were standing there stoically. 10 more guarded the rest of the property. Although any president would need security, it felt a bit more like they were holding him hostage than protecting him at this point. He'd been hunkered down in this beautiful home on Lake Placid for a month. The house was owned by one of Tate's most staunch supporters and financial backers, who'd agreed to let Tate hide out in his vacation home until they could find a safe country for him to seek sanctuary and establish a government in exile. Marshal Tate already knew the gig was up with the Europeans, and even with most of his own countrymen. As much as he hated to admit it, the only way he was going to stay president was if the Chinese won the war or agreed to let him take over as president of the occupied territories. He'd already reached out to the Chinese several times during the last couple of weeks to try and get that in the works. They had agreed to allow him to flee to China until they could set up a more permanent solution for him in America. The challenge Tate's security team was dealing with now was figuring out how to move him to China. When the UN force had collapsed and surrendered en masse, Tate had suddenly found himself in a precarious position. With no military support or help from the UN, he'd been cut off from his safe passage out of North America. Sure, some of the CDF militia forces were still fighting on in New York and the Northeast, but they wouldn't last much longer. Now that the secret was out about how the election had been rigged to allow him to win, his popular support among the people was rapidly evaporating. The people who had once rallied to join the militia to fight and retake their government had suddenly realized they had been duped. That had swiftly ended their will to fight and die for his cause. I wonder how Lance is doing in all of this, he thought. Lance Solomon, like Marshall, was among the most wanted men in the world right now. Lance had somehow managed to flee the country prior to everything collapsing. That said, there was a worldwide manhunt underway to find him. Suddenly the movie ended. Tate hadn't even noticed until someone turned the lights on and his wife brushed his arm. "Honey, are you going to stay up for a little while longer or come to bed?" she asked. Her eyes betrayed how tired she was. Looking up at her, Tate smiled. "I'll be up soon. I just need to talk with Jerome and Paige first." She smiled and kissed him on the forehead. "Don't be too long, darling. You need to rest more." He nodded, and then got up to go find his 2 senior aides. A moment later, he walked into the study and found Jerome and Paige sitting there with retired Admiral David Hill, his Secretary of Defense. The trio stopped talking when he walked in. Hill quickly got up and poured him a glass of some of the finest Scotch whiskey Tate had ever tasted. They both took their seats, and then there was an awkward pause, as if everyone knew they were about to talk about something difficult. Tate took a sip of the alcohol and allowed it to seep all the way into his gut. There wasn't a drink in the world strong enough to dull this awful situation. Finally, he decided to rip the Band-Aid off. "What are our options at this point?" he asked bluntly. "Is there any way to take the Chinese up on their latest offer and get out of the country?" Paige leaned forward. "We'd like to just get you on a plane and fly you directly to Russia and then China, but obviously that can't happen. So we're working on an alternate way of getting you out of the country." "Okay, this sounds promising, but I take it there's a hitch to this plan." Admiral Hill nodded. "There sure is. Right now, there isn't any direct air travel between the U.S. and Russia, or between Canada and Russia. So we're trying to figure out how we can get you out surreptitiously without being spotted." "There is one way we can get you out, but it's a lot longer and, frankly, I don't think you're going to like it," Paige said as she took a sip of the whiskey. "All right, Paige. Well, let me be the judge of what I won't like," Tate countered. "It can't be any worse than being cooped up here, unable to even leave the house for fear of being spotted." He was growing stir-crazy. The only time he was allowed to venture outside was at night, when even a neighbor couldn't see him to recognize who he was. Admiral Hill grunted. "We've got a small aircraft that's going to pick you up at the airport in town. It'll fly you to the Canadian island of St. John's. From there, you'll catch a ride on a freighter that'll be sailing back to Europe. Once the ship is at sea, there's a Russian billionaire who will meet up with the freighter, and you'll board his mega yacht. They'll cruise the rest of the way to Russia, where you'll be able to catch a private jet that'll take you to Beijing." Tate leaned back in his chair. "It's crazy, but it just might work," he thought. "I see 2 issues," said Tate. "How is the plane going to make it there without getting caught? and I wasn't aware there were freighters being allowed through the American blockade yet." "The plane will make it through fine," Page countered. "We're reconfiguring the plane's transponder to make it appear like one of the Air Force's Skytruck planes. It's a small troop transport craft used for small, rugged landings on remote outposts. It'll easily carry you and your wife along with a handful of your security personnel out of here." Furrowing his brow, Tate clarified. "You guys are coming with, right?" Admiral Hill shook his head. "No, we're going to stay here and try to keep the insurgency going while you get a government in exile set up in China." Marshal Tate didn't say anything right away. He couldn't help but wonder if it might be better to just let the insurgency die out while they try and play their cards with the Chinese and hope for a better outcome. Looking at his closest advisors, though, he saw they were not going to be swayed. They'd stay and fight and put their trust in him being able to work out a better deal for them with the Chinese in a post-war world. Finally, Tate nodded his head in approval. "Okay, I'll do what I can for us from China. We'll figure out how they can provide support to the insurgency and your efforts. So when do I leave?" Trondheim, Norway. Lance Solomon pulled his fedora a little lower on his head to help hide his eyes and face as he left the bakery. With his goods in his bag, he walked down to where he had locked his bike up. After retrieving his bicycle and placing his groceries in the back, he pedaled toward the Airbnb he had rented. While Lance had never thought he'd need to escape America, here he was, hiding in plain sight in Norway, hoping with everything in him that he would one day be able to return to his home country and not face treason charges. When he developed his bug-out plan several years ago, Lance had had a very good forger create a new U.S. passport and a Norwegian passport for him. After his fake identity had been created in Norway, he'd stashed away a few $1 million in multiple different banks for just this type of scenario. Lance knew if he had to go to this extreme and flee his country, he'd need credit and debit cards ready in advance so he could legitimately live out the rest of his life in obscurity in another country. Then his whole world had come crashing down when he'd received an urgent message, alerting him that Roberto had gone missing. Fearing the worst, Lance took it upon himself to fly to Brussels for an impromptu meeting with some of his EU banking counterparts. He hoped the activity wouldn't draw suspicion. It was a normal thing he'd do as the head of Goldman Sachs, especially as his bank was doing its best to help the Sachs administration put the financial sector back together once New York had been liberated from the UN. When Lance had completed his business for the firm, he'd told Goldman Sachs that he'd decided to stay for an additional week to meet with some additional bank executives from the UK. It was during this period that he vanished. While a body double he'd hired was using his electronic devices in London, Lance had gone to ground. He'd had his hair dyed and used specially designed contact lenses that caused his eye color to change depending on the ambient light outside. Next, he'd made a trip to a plastic surgeon who could do discreet work. He'd had his nose changed, added some collagen implants to change the dimensions of his cheeks, and then utilized some Botox in his forehead for good measure. When the surgeon was done with him, he truly did look like a completely different person. 2 days later, the forger Lance had been put in touch with had changed the image on his Norwegian passport to match his new look. Then he was off. That had been nearly a month ago. As he continued to read the headlines online, he realized he'd gotten out at just the right time. Within a day of him pulling off his disappearing act, his face had been plastered all across the news, along with photos of his co-conspirators. His heart had sunk when he'd listened to the news reports and heard what was being said about him. He'd spent a lifetime getting to the position he had achieved. Once Marshal Tate had taken power, he had been slated to be designated as the new Treasury Secretary. He'd finally be in a position to influence the course of the U.S. economy. But now, he was a hunted man. He wasn't sure how long he'd have to live in hiding, but if this was to be his new life, then he was determined to make the most of it. For the time being, he spent nearly every waking hour learning how to speak Norwegian. He watched endless hours of Norwegian TV and news channels to help speed up his learning. He had known a little bit of the language before he'd chosen this place to hide out in, but he now needed to make himself appear as if he'd lived there his whole life. He didn't want the Norwegian government or the Americans to somehow figure out who he was and hunt him down. Oslo, Norway. Erik Jan looked around the table at the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, the Minister of Justice, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. They were deciding what to do with him, now that all the cards had been laid on the table by the Americans. The evidence of his involvement in this plot to rig the American election was pretty overwhelming. "You've put us and the entire Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund in great jeopardy, Erik," said the Prime Minister as she studied him. "You've done more than that. You've endangered every citizen in this country," insisted the Finance Minister. "Our nation, our people, and our entire financial system depended on the success of the fund you managed. The Americans are threatening to seize any U.S. assets the fund currently owns, including stocks, along with blocking the fund from doing any business with the American banking system. We're talking about more than $1 trillion, Erik." His face conveyed the sheer panic that was just below the surface of everyone in the room. Sitting as straight as he could, Erik exclaimed, "You can't hand me over to the Americans. They will surely put me to death." "You should have thought about that before you financed this entire scheme," scolded the Prime Minister. "What were you thinking? Financing a coup d'etat inside America? My God, Erik! Do you realize what you have done to Norway? To the world?" The look of disappointment on her face belied the anger that was burning in her eyes. Erik had been a key reason why she'd become Prime Minister, but he had put her in an untenable position. The Minister of Justice looked at Erik briefly with a sad expression, before he turned his full attention to the Prime Minister. "Madam Prime Minister, Erik's right. They will put him to death for this. Under our current laws and EU treaties, they can't extradite a Norwegian citizen to a nation that has the death penalty, if we know that country will pursue that charge." The Minister of Justice was one of the few allies Erik currently had left. They had a long history together. Erik knew he needed to say something. "You could try me here, Madam Prime Minister," he offered. "Under our laws, I could be convicted and spared the death sentence." The Prime Minister silently thought for a moment. She reached over, grabbed her coffee cup and took a sip, not saying anything as the others waited for her response. Eventually, she leaned in, and in a soft tone, replied, "Erik, I think you should wait outside for the moment. We need to discuss what would be best for Norway." Erik grimaced. What would be best for the country might not coincide with what would be best for him, and he knew it. Nodding, he got up and made his way to the door and the chairs outside the office. He hoped his society brother would be able to persuade them to agree to charge him in Norway. If his friend failed, then his time would be up. Once Erik had left the room, the Foreign Minister jumped into the conversation for the first time. "We have to hand him over, Madam Prime Minister," he insisted. "If we do not, the Americans have said they will attack our country with their stealth bombers, They can and would do considerable damage to our country." The Minister of Justice shook his head. "No," he countered forcefully. "If we do that, they'll condemn him to death. It goes against every law we have and our treaties with the EU. We cannot hand him over. We must try him here, in Norway." The foreign minister slammed his hand down hard on the table, startling them all as he raised his voice. "He deserves to be put to death! Look at America. More than 1 million people have been killed in that country in the last 4 months. What Eric and his fellow cronies did has forever changed the course of history. The UN as an organization may never recover from this, and our relationship with America is going to be affected by this for generations, Madam Prime Minister." He paused for a moment as he shook his head. Then he added, "We need to be strong and show the Americans that our government had no idea Eric was doing this, that he had somehow gone rogue. We need to make amends with the Americans and do it publicly and swiftly so we can regain control of the situation in the eyes of our people and the Americans." The Prime Minister raised her hand to silence the arguing between her senior advisers. She looked out the window, where she could see thousands of protesters holding signs and yelling some sort of chant. They were angry. They were confused. They were looking for a scapegoat. Turning around to face her 3 advisers, she announced, "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to tell the Americans where Eric is and a specific time he'll be in that particular location. We'll let them apprehend him so we're not breaking any of our own laws or EU treaties. The Americans are demanding that the member states that participated in this now illegal UN war be held financially liable for the damage they've caused. I propose that we take all of the U.S.-held assets and stocks in our sovereign wealth fund and liquidate them. Then we should contribute the funds to the trusts the Americans have set up to compensate the victims of this terrible war. It isn't going to make everything right, but it will show the Americans and the rest of the world that we are serious about accepting responsibility for what we've done, and that we are trying to make amends." The foreign minister visibly breathed a sigh of relief. "I'll work something out with the Americans," he said. "I'll make the appropriate arrangements," echoed the finance minister. With that, Eric Jan's fate was sealed. Chapter 8. The Camps. Metcalf, Mississippi, DHS Detention Camp 14. Captain Quinn stood inside an air-conditioned terminal of Mid-Delta Regional Airport with George Thomas, watching the 1st Air Force C-5 Galaxy land and taxi over toward them. Just outside the terminal were roughly 100 private contractors and 15 yellow school buses, ready to greet the passengers of the giant Air Force transport planes. As the first Galaxy moved off the runway and taxied towards them, a second aircraft landed. Each plane carried roughly 350 prisoners from the UN force that had surrendered. Each day, a total of 4 of these aircraft would make 2 trips, one in the morning, then a second in the evening. It was a grueling task having to move this many prisoners a day, but they had to do it. "Do you think we're going to have enough camps for all these prisoners they keep sending us?" asked Captain Quinn as he finished downing his coffee. He crumpled up the disposable cup and tossed it in the nearby wastebasket. George shrugged his shoulders. "I think so. We have 16 camps with a capacity of 6,000 prisoners apiece. Then again, I could log back into my email when we get back to the office and find out if I've been tasked with getting any more camps set up." Quinn snickered. "You know, my battalion commander is happy as hell with this gig," he said with a smile. "He hopes we have to build more, because it means we'll have plenty of work here, so we won't have to deploy to go fight the Chinese." George eyed Captain Quinn. And you? He asked. Would you rather be running a prison camp or fighting the Chinese? Quinn paused, watching the Galaxy taxi to the buses. Finally, he turned back to George. My wife's happy I'm here, he replied. So are my kids, because we can see each other throughout the month. But our country's been invaded. I'd like to be doing what I can to free America. George nodded. I'm with you there. But look at it this way. Your battalion is freeing up other active duty units to go fight instead of babysitting a bunch of POWs. You're doing your part in this war. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You're a damn good company commander, Quinn. Your camp is run so much better than many of the others. Thanks for the compliment, Quinn said nonchalantly. But I'm only as good as my soldiers. I'm fortunate to have 8 of my guys who just so happen to work in the prison system in their regular day jobs. They've helped me get things squared away faster than I think I could have otherwise. Really? Which ones? What do they do? Asked George, his interest clearly piqued. Ah, I see what you're doing. You want to poach them from me. Well, I'm not telling you, Quinn replied jovially. They both laughed. Actually, 4 of my guys are sheriff's deputies who work for the county jail in Jackson. Another guy works at a federal prison, and another 3 work at the state penitentiary, he explained. You know, that is the one thing I love about you National Guardsmen. You guys have soldiers from all types of civilian jobs in your units, George commented. You guys really know what they're doing, in some ways more than the active duty guys. The Galaxy had now stopped in front of the prison guards and the school buses. Slowly, the nose of the plane opened up to reveal 350 prisoners wearing bright neon green jumpsuits with a POW emblem printed on both the front and rear. Each jumpsuit had the prisoner's name, home nation, and military rank on it as well. Intermixed with the prisoners being offloaded was a rare sight. Roughly 50 or so prisoners wearing the bright pink jumpsuits. These prisoners, unlike the POWs, had hand and leg shackles, and the word traitor was printed on the front and back of their uniforms, along with their name and their home state. These were the captured Civilian Defense Force militia members. Each camp had roughly 10% of its population made up from these former CDF soldiers. These prisoners would be given a public defender and a court date when they'd be prosecuted. If they were found guilty, then, depending on their charges, they'd either serve a sentence in a federal prison or they'd face a firing squad shortly after their conviction. As the first aircraft emptied its human cargo, the second Galaxy taxied over to the parking spot next to the first one. A fuel truck came out to attach the fuel lines to the ground pumps to get the first C-5 fueled back up and ready to go pick up its next load. Well, George, I need to get out there and make sure things are running smoothly, said Captain Quinn. It was good talking to you. Let me know when you're going to pay us a visit. I'll make sure we have some fresh, sweet tea ready for you. He then waved farewell and headed out into the heat. I think we're going to need more camps if they keep bringing us plane loads of prisoners like this every day, Quinn thought as he walked to his next task. Martin sat near the front of the school bus, next to a couple of military contractors, as they drove from the airport to wherever it was they were taking him. As they traveled through the countryside, Martin had to admit he liked what he was seeing. The large magnolia and oak trees were beautiful, and the famous Spanish moss that hung from so many of the trees down south seemed mysterious and inviting. What he didn't like, however, was the oppressive heat and the thick humidity. They were barely into May, and the hot, sticky air was already becoming unbearable. 15 minutes into their drive, Martin finally saw the edges of the large, sprawling camp that would become his home. As they drew closer, he he could see that the 15-foot-tall outer fence was lined with multiple layers of razor-sharp concertina wire. He quickly noticed there was probably about a 15-foot gap between the outer fence and the next fence. The inner fence was probably around 12 feet in height and was also dual-wrapped in concertina wire. In between the two fences, pairs of German shepherds roamed the no-man's land, accompanied by guards. Wow, they sure mean business at this camp, thought Martin. The bus finally came to a halt in front of a long, narrow building. The bus ahead of them was in the process of unloading its prisoners, filing into one end of the building and out the other end. It was what was happening at the other end that concerned him. In his pink jumpsuit, he stood out from the rest of the crowd. There were only a handful of prisoners on the bus wearing the same color as he was. "Everyone off the bus," ordered one of the guards. "Form 2 lines behind the groups ahead of you. Those of you wearing a pink jumpsuit, you'll line up against the wall over there by those other 4. Martin stood at the front of the bus and got off, along with the other guards and the driver, as they stood guard at the entrance, ready to guide the new arrivals to where they needed to go. People started exiting the bus and getting in line, just as they had been told. Martin made his way over to the line with half a dozen others in pink jumpsuits. "You guys have any idea what's coming next?" he asked. "Nothing's good, I'm sure," one of them replied glumly. After standing around in the heat for 5 hours, watching busload after busload of POWs move through the building, their group was eventually processed into the camps. "Put your right hand on the screen in front of you," ordered one of the guards. "Now your left. And look into this camera. Chin up." There was a pause. "State your name," another guard ordered. "Martin Brown," stated Martin matter-of-factly. After another pause, the first guard announced, "Biometrics checkout." "Move along to that table against the wall to provide your home of record and your emergency contact, if you have one," ordered a third guard. Martin followed the instructions. After that, he was organized into a group of 20 prisoners and marched to a shower room. "Strip down naked," ordered one of the guards. "You will each be deloused, and then you will be allowed 3 minutes to shower and wash up." Dear God, please let that be all that happens in here, Martin thought, horrified by a million scenarios in which his situation could go sideways. Several minutes later, he was done cleaning up, and a guard told him to put his jumpsuit back on. When they were all dressed again, they were moved as a group to the next room. At the next station, they were brought in 10 at a time to a barber chair, where their hair was summarily buzzed off, leaving them bald. The guards explained that this would cut down on the chance of them getting any lice, and would help with the heat as they were starting the hot summer season. Following that joyous experience, they were each handed a laundry bag. Inside each bag was a prison-issued toothbrush, deodorant, towel, 2 changes of pink jumpsuits, and a pair of Crocs they'd use for shoes. At the next station, their names and home state were stenciled onto their jumpsuits. Once they had gone through all that, they walked into another room to see several nurses or medics standing there with what appeared to be medical air guns with small vials attached to them. "Walk through the line 1 at a time," ordered the guard at the door. As they passed each person, they were given 2 shots, 1 in each arm. After receiving a total of 6 shots, the guard announced, "Now pull down your pants a bit. You'll be given a penicillin shot in your gluteus maximus." When the entire process was completed, Martin and the others were moved into a large room with rows of bench seats. The room was about half full when Martin arrived, and one of the guards gruffly ordered, "Take a seat and don't say a word to anyone." A couple of prisoners tried to comment quietly to each other, but a guard walked over and shouted at them, "Shut up! What part of don't talk to anyone don't you understand?" A few expletives were shouted, and the men visibly shrank back. An uncomfortable silence followed, which felt like an hour to Martin. Once the room was full, an army officer walked in with several armed guards. The captain moved to the podium at the front. He took a moment to look them over before he spoke. "My name is Captain Quinn," he began. "You are now at a joint DHS-DOD prisoner camp. This is Camp 14. For the duration of your stay here, you will listen to the guards and do as you are told. We will, for the most part, leave you alone. But if you choose not to listen or be rebellious, then we'll make your life incredibly hard. For the time being, you will be treated just like the other POWs, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. However, the moment you start a fight, the moment you try to break out, you'll experience a world of hurt you didn't know was possible. Right now you are classified as unlawful enemy combatants. You will be tried for your crimes by a federal judge within 30 days. Tomorrow, you will meet with your public defender. If you're wealthy enough to afford a private lawyer, you may discuss that with your PD. Your PD will work with you to go over the evidence against you and advise you of what your options are. Depending upon what you are convicted of, you will either be cut loose, serve a prison term given to you by the judge and jury, or be put to death by firing squad. Martin heard some murmurs amongst the prisoners before a guard shouted at the crowd to shut up. "I sure hope they aren't going to give me the death penalty," Martin thought, horrified. Captain Quinn continued. "If you are convicted of a crime that results in the death penalty, you will be executed the following Friday. Every Friday, all prisoners in pink jumpsuits are required to attend the public executions." Martin shuddered. "Court dates are Monday through Wednesday of every week," announced Quinn. "Your lawyer time with your assigned PD or private lawyer will be on Thursdays and Sundays, depending on when your lawyer wants to meet with you. You are not allowed any visitors. You will be allowed to make one 5-minute phone call on Thursday and one call on Sundays. If you are given the death penalty, you will be given a final meal the night before and allowed to talk to whomever you want for up to 60 minutes to say your final farewells. You will also be afforded 4 hours of time with a legal professional to get your will in order if needed. If you have any questions, you may direct your questions to your barracks representative. They will bring those questions up to the barracks guard in the morning after breakfast and in the evening directly after dinner." Captain Quinn paused for a second before he continued. "Now listen very closely to what I'm about to tell you. If you attack one of my guards or any of the contractors in the camp, you will be summarily executed on the spot. If you kill one of your fellow prisoners, you will be executed on the spot. I run a tight ship here. Your stay can either be pleasant or it can be miserable. That decision is entirely yours. Breakfast is served between 0600 and 0800 daily. Your barracks rep will let you know what time slot your barracks may enter the chow hall. Lunch and dinner work the same way. If you are hurt or sick, there is an infirmary in the center of the camp. Sick call starts at 0600 and runs until 1400 daily. Lights out is promptly at 2200 hours. Reveille is at 0500. What you do during the day is up to you, but do not cause trouble or fight. I won't tolerate it, and neither will the other prisoners. That is all." Then Captain Quinn promptly turned and walked out of the room. One of the guards then shouted, "All right, everybody up. Time to get your barracks designation. Call out your last name when you reach the door, and I'll tell you what barracks you've been assigned to. Once you have that information, proceed to your barracks and report in to your rep. He'll give you the rundown from there." One of the other guards moved over to the door near the front of the building and propped it open. The prisoners then lined up in front of the guard with the clipboard. Martin had to marvel at how smooth this entire process had been. Aside from being the last group to process into the camp, they had moved them along like they were on some sort of assembly line. As the line in front of Martin got smaller, he readied himself. Finally, it was his turn. "Brown," he announced. "First name?" asked the guard. Apparently there was more than one person with the same last name. "Martin." The guard looked at him. "You're in barracks 6C. Next." And just like that, it was over. All that waiting in line, moving from one station to another, had finally ended. Martin walked out the door so the next guy could get his assignment. Barracks 6C. Where the hell is that? He wondered. Then he saw a large map of the camp a few feet away, where a handful of other prisoners had gathered. As Martin approached, he could see that there were 10 lines of tents, with 6 tents to a line. He found 6C and headed that direction. As he walked through the camp, Martin saw several people playing chess or checkers. Some were reading books, and others were just talking. He heard people speaking other languages. More than a few of the prisoners must have been Chinese. Eventually, he found the tent he was looking for and opened the outer door. He took a deep breath and let it out, walking into an uncertain future.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.